Okay, so my name's Jasmine, and as Ben mentioned, I'm another teacher of the deaf. I'm going to follow on talking about whole class explicit teaching to improve listening skills and looking at some activities and ways that you can teach it from a whole class perspective. So as a special educator hearing, often we're looking at wave 3 intervention for children who are deaf, hard of hearing to do with listening skills. But what I'm talking about today is wave 1, because we know wave 1 is where we have the biggest impact on student learning outcomes. We're not just talking about deaf, hard of hearing children, we're talking about all children and how you can practice and reinforce listening skills. So we know that in the Australian curriculum, one of the general capabilities is comprehending text through listening. Looking at that in more depth, we have the literacy learning progression, which talks about all the listening skills and how you move through those. So I'm not going to read them all, but just to have a look, you can see how it evolves from being able to distinguish between two sounds to then moving to short phrases, how to recognise and repeat familiar words, how to recall ideas, discriminate between words. So obviously, as you go through the learning progression, the skills become increasingly harder. Moving on to learning about vocab and recounting and recognising connectives and recalling specific information. And then moving on into identifying things like main ideas, discussing the language features, organising information that's heard, paraphrasing, identifying shifts in directions in the line of argument. So listening, I think, is often perceived as a skill that needs to be taught in junior primary, but if you look at the progression, it does continue throughout schooling. Just wanted to make the comment about listening and reading, and I know that Ben also touched on this. Obviously, listening can be a harder task when you have people speaking in connected speech because it's not as standardised as print. People, I guess, pause, they don't speak in full words. It's not permanent, you can't go back to the text. Once it's spoken, it's gone, so you need to be quicker at processing. So it's a different type of skill, and sometimes you need to take the print away and focus on that listening comprehension before you bring the print in. I also just wanted to comment on the side, there's a photo there of some people that look like they're potentially signing. So when you have signing deaf, hard of hearing children, you do need to work on receptive language skills, and you do need to work on listening in terms of comprehending sign discourse. But that's not what the focus of this presentation is. We're not going to cover too much on that, but some of these activities could be modified for kids that don't use oral language. So typically when we're talking about explicitly teaching to the whole class listening skills, the first thing we think of is the 5 L's and that junior primary type focus. And I guess one of the messages from today is to move away from that and also think about how you explicitly teach listening skills in upper primary and for high school students. So how you state the expectations. For example, I'm going to speak for the next 10 minutes. In that time, I want you to listen for this, or I want everybody to have complete focus because this is the learning intent of this listening task. So it's about not just having that expectation when you've got junior primary kids sitting on the floor. There's lots of different ways we can model and explicitly teach good listening strategies. So these are just some of them. I'll just sort of touch on them. One is teaching people about nonverbal or body language explicitly. Not every child learns that innately. Maybe teaching how to repeat or internalise directions, having the teacher listen to something and then show how internally they review that in their mind and how they hold on to key words, and using acoustic highlighting to show what key words are giving them information, so putting emphasis on those words. The teacher modelling not starting until you've heard all of the instruction, taking that time, counting to 3, giving processing time before responding as an important part of listening. How to repair communications, so how to recognise if there is communication breakdown, how to ask for clarification and request more information, and to move away from the general huh or what to get a repeat without actually asking a specific question about what you want repeated. Talking speaking aloud about what you're going to do and picturing it in your mind. So talking to students using Think Aloud to describe when someone's giving me oral instructions, what is happening inside my brain, what am I visualising, what connections am I making, and making that clear. Also asking students to give feedback on what they witness. Let them see what the teacher's doing when they're listening if you're explicitly teaching listening skills. Or use sabotage, so deliberately modelling poor listening and then asking students to identify what you did or didn't do well as a way of explicit teaching. There's lots of texts, and I'm sure if you went to SERU you could borrow texts about explicitly teaching listening skills and why it's important. There's also a lot of videos online where you can do activities, or you can cover explicit teaching of why we need to listen and what that looks like. And there's lots of resources and games, so you don't need to create listening barrier games. You can borrow these resources. There was a study done, it's a little bit older now, but the reason I want to draw your attention to this is because it was done on deaf and hard of hearing children, and it was about communication breakdowns and taking a natural language sample at how often deaf hard of hearing children recognised that there was a communication breakdown and how often they attempted to repair it and how many times they repaired it successfully. The reason I mention this is that if you're trying to teach listening skills, it's really important that you identify what is the issue or what is the next step skill that a lot of students in your class are having difficulty with. If you're going to do whole class explicit instruction, you want to be really clear on what is the skill you want them to get better at and how are you going to measure whether students are getting better at that. So in this particular instance, they provided some intervention, explicit teaching around communication breakdowns, and as a result, these students got better at one, not having as many breakdowns, but secondly, being able to use specific requests when there was a breakdown rather than just for a generalistic repeat. So being really particular about what you're targeting is important. The other thing to think about is explicit teaching is often seen as the teacher at the front of the class doing direct instruction. Explicit teaching is really powerful in context. And we know one of the hardest circumstances in which to use listening skills is during group work and communicating with peers, and it's also the most common time when there will be communication breakdowns. So it's important to take all those teachable moments and opportunities for explicit teaching, pausing the group and saying, look, I like how I saw this person doing this listening skill, or, you know, what do you think we could have done differently, or why isn't this communication working? And getting students to give feedback to one another about their listening skills. And just a small comment that if you do have a child who is deaf, hard of hearing, or has auditory processing difficulties, in these situations, sometimes you do need a quiet environment because the level of background noise makes it really, really hard in group situations. So just keeping that in mind when you are doing this type of listening tasks. I guess the biggest message, if you're explicitly teaching listening skills, is to change your practice to focused listening. So instead of saying, okay, we're going to listen to this video or we're going to listen to this story, we're going to listen for. Giving the students the learning intent, why they're listening, what they're looking for, will help guide their thinking while they're listening. As teachers of the deaf, we often use the listening comprehension test, and so this provides an age norm of where a child's functioning in their ability to recognise the main idea, to recall the specific details, to reason when they are given information, their understanding of the vocab used, and their overall general understanding of the message, whether they got the message. So in this assessment, we provide oral clips and students have to respond to questions. And it lets us know where they need further support. So you can do this with your whole class, where students might have difficulty determining what is the main idea. So you can work with them to listen to something and call out what is the general theme, and then move that to something more complex. So it could be you had a book about a boy and a dog, and the first step is for them to recognise who is in this book, or who is in this story. And the second step is, what is the theme, like companionship or friendship. So modelling and getting other students to give feedback so that they see the connections people are making when they're listening. If you want to explicitly teach to the whole class about retaining details, you can provide a listening activity and then talk about the main idea being the trunk of a tree, and then the branches supporting being all the little details, the bits that give you information. If you want to talk about reasoning, you can explicitly teach qualifiers, words like likely, usually, seldom. You can put them on a line to show what they mean, like the subtle differences between vocab. You can give definitions and then see if students can pick the vocab that matches and do all that vocab unpacking. And you could ask students to paraphrase and then look for their accuracy and give feedback about their accuracy when they paraphrase. Just breaking down the task of listening comprehension. So these are a few more ideas about how we support and how we expect children to listen. Number one is gaining attention. So if you could do that by flashing the lights or clapping your hands. Teachers have lots of different ways of gaining the class's attention, but then having that pause and ensuring you have everybody listening before you start speaking, which sounds really simple, but often teachers will start talking over before the students, they have their attention, which becomes really difficult. You could have a success criteria. So what does good listening look like? You could have peers give feedback on another child's listening skills. You can unpack what you're expecting over a lesson. So today we're going to have 5 minutes of instruction time, then you're going to work in groups, but what are the listening skills you're looking for in those different situations and in those different times? You can ask students to predict something and then listen for the answer. So again, that's that listening, what are we listening for? There's lots of ways where you can keep monitoring students' comprehensions while they're listening. So asking them to put up their hand, put their thumb up, or change some cups so they've got red, orange or green on top to show their level of understanding, or hold up a number card, or hold up a choice. Do you think it's A or B, or true or false? And they've got cards. So everybody's constantly giving feedback about what they're listening and hearing rather than one person responding to a question. The other thing you can do is have pop sticks, or you can use your class dojo where all students know that they might be called upon next. So I'm about to ask a question, I'm going to pull a name out, everybody's name is here. So when it's appropriate, you can use that kind of strategy. So they go, oh, I better listen because I could be called upon to answer this. Just reinforcing discourse markers. So when you change to a new topic or you're moving on to something, really making that separation clear to students supports their listening. And auditory bombardment. So if you want students to acquire new vocab, constantly reinforcing that word and exposing that word and really targeting that and putting emphasis on that can support students to listen and to pick up that cue. Again, just to unpack a little more, another strategy that really supports students to listen is scaffolding background information. So as much as possible prior to doing the listening task, having that discussion about prior knowledge, about understanding of vocab, concept knowledge, prior concept knowledge, unpacking the genre, what we're about to listen for. The more you unpack and build the field before you delve into the task, the better chance they have of knowing what they're about to be listening to and listening for. And if you can, providing visuals like listening organisers. So when they're listening and if you're asking them to retain anything or afterwards write something down, if they've got a structure, so they've got a graphic organiser or a visual prompt, that will support their understanding and their thinking. Also being mindful of split attention. So when we ask a child to listen and at the same time write notes, that can be really hard, particularly deaf and hard of hearing children that are looking for visual cues like lip patterning and facial expressions. It's really hard to expect someone to write and listen at the same time. But also for children who are not deaf, hard of hearing, split attention can be really hard, being asked to do two things. So giving multiple opportunities to listen listening first, then doing the task, or listening, looking at the example, then back to listening, to try and, I guess, allow children the opportunity to just focus on that listening when they are doing it. And finally, another support is student self-evaluation of their own listening skills. So you could have a rating scale or a tick box or a questionnaire, and get students to reflect on what listening skills they have and don't, or what they need to work on, or what supports them in class to listen and retain information, or in social situations with their peers, and even having a goal. So if you're working on a listening skill, does the whole class know what the goal is, what they're trying to get better at, or do individuals have goals that they're working on? Okay, so the next section is just some activities. So these activities are pretty broad, just to get people thinking about the types of things you can do as listening activities. Ideally, you want to embed it into whatever you're doing. So it's not, oh, and now we do listening. Listening occurs all the time, so you want to embed it into the concept knowledge you want kids to have, or their day-to-day tasks. So this is just some suggestions to get you thinking about how you incorporate listening. I think the first question to ask yourself is, if you're going to use a listening task, what are you trying to achieve? Are you teaching a listening skill? Are you practicing a listening skill? Or are you testing a listening skill? And I think often with listening activities, it's really easy to test, but we're not actually supporting kids to get better, which is where that explicit teaching comes in. Also, is the listening task, is it either you heard it or you didn't, or you got the detail or you didn't, or how are you going to measure whether a child is getting some of the information, or is it open-ended enough that you can have a child functioning below, at, and above what is expected, and how are you going to see that? So considering that, and what is the purpose? So are you trying to reinforce content, or what's the purpose of the task? Because you don't want standalone listening tasks. These activities are just broken into detection, discrimination, identification, comprehension tasks. And I think Hannah will speak a little bit more about that. And it's just showing that it's the same skill set, but in a whole class environment at a wave 1 level. We've got some here for detection, and so you would expect typically, this is an early years task, being able to detect sound, but you can do things like playing a drum and jumping every time you hear the drum, or waiting and pausing, those anticipation type games with noise, or every time the rhythm changes, you change your action, you start stomping. If the rhythm gets fast, you move fast. That's at the base level. Discrimination, if you're doing it whether children can hear something without getting into literacy, you can just do it simply, can they hear the difference between two sounds? So if you've got tins or boxes containing different materials, can they hear the different sounds, or can they match the ones that are the same? Or with shakers, can they copy a pattern and retain a pattern? Can they have the whole class where each child's given a noise and they make that noise, and you go looking for your partner with the matching noise? Then you have your phonological awareness skills. So can children recognise how many words are in a sentence, or how many syllables in a word? Can they recognise the initial, medial, final sound, rhyme, isolating sounds, recognising the first and last sound, or being able to segment or add or substitute phonemes or delete phonemes? So that's some of the stuff that's embedded in a lot of whole school literacy programs, and obviously is really important foundation skills. So these are some ideas for identification listening skills. So you could do things like bingo, where children are listening for a particular word or a particular sound. Or you can present sounds either with the smartboard apps, or videos of animal sounds or household sounds, and ask students to try and identify them. Or you've got lots of movement games like fruit salad, where people are listening for a particular word to know that it's their turn to move. Or you can do a sound story, where every time children hear a word that means laugh, so for example, if they hear chuckle or giggle, they make that laughing sound, or every time you hear the word cry or something that means cry, like whimper or tear, you make a crying sound. So whilst they're listening, they're also actively doing something. Or you could do word identification. So give me a thumbs up. I'm going to talk about the parts of a flower. Every time you hear this word, I want you to give me a thumbs up if you hear one of the parts that we've labelled on the diagram. Or every time you hear a multiple of 5, I want you to clap your hands. So there's that action when they hear something and they identify a word. And then there's activities like Blind Simon Says, where children play Simon Says but with their eyes closed. And this is really good if you've got children with conductive hearing loss and you're trying to see who's not hearing well on a given day. But you can say words like nose and toes or knees, words that sound really similar where they have to listen really carefully, or put your hands in the air, or ear or hair, or cheek or chin, using those word combinations that are very difficult to hear the difference between, where you have to listen really intently and whether they can identify those words. Then there's just a few activities to practice comprehension. This is games called Spotty, but you could do it with anything where you say, put the blue spot on high up on the wall, or, put the odd numbers on something green, or where they're moving and they're having to listen to the critical elements. So, the colour, the place, and follow that sequence or do it in a particular sequence. You can do activities like the restaurant game or grandma, where you've got 3 people, so you've got like a relayer. So the mother tells the grandmother something, and then the grandmother has to go and collect those ingredients, or it could be 3D shapes, collect those shapes and collect them in order and bring them back. Or you've got a customer who makes an order, and then the waitress has to take that to the cook, and then the cook has to give the correct things. The waitress has to then relay it correctly back to the customer. So those 3-way games where you're doing auditory memory skills, either with picture cues or with physical objects or just orally, and just transferring that kind of game to any kind of content or concept that you're teaching. You could do tell a story and say there's going to be an error, so prepare children that there's going to be something that's incorrect and get them to listen for that error and how did they know it was incorrect. You could do any guessing games, oral guessing games, where if you've been learning about transport, you have different types of transport and people ask questions and they have to listen and guess, kind of like celebrity heads style games. But it could be done with states of matter or whatever concept you're working on, where you're orally describing something and then someone has to guess the main idea or the concept. You can give children story cards that they have to reorder and then retell. So you tell the story and then give them the jumbled visuals, and they have to unjumble the visuals and retell to a peer or to the group. You can do lots and lots of different barrier games where people are working in pairs and describing things and manipulating objects or colouring things or drawing things, and then comparing how that matches to the original. Lost and found is where a child reports an item lost, and the first child has the image, so they describe what's been lost, describe the item. The second person then relays that to the third person, who then writes it down, and then you compare the descriptions at the end. Or you can do it as modelled at the front of the class, and the class provides feedback on how they went. Or painting or drawing, or do a mind map of delivering oral story and then getting them to individuals to draw or write as much content as they can remember from that, and then comparing the different details people remembered and included. Or you can do a story question and answer. A child might have a card that says what or a card that says when, and whenever they hear the when described, they hold up their card. So then they're listening for something in particular. So as mentioned, these are just some ideas of tasks and ways it could be embedded. It really depends on your context, depends on your subject area, but they're activities that you can consider embedding.